October 1347, 12 trading ships pull into the port of Messina, Sicily. The port officials walk out to meet them, and what they find is that most of the sailors are already dead. The ones still alive, they're covered in black swellings, the size of eggs, at their necks, their armpits, their groins, pus and blood seeping through their skin, delirious, burning up. The officials do the only thing they can think of. They ordered the ships out of the harbor. They were too late. Within 18 months, a third of Europe was dead. Some regions lost half, some lost more. We don't have the exact number, because the plague killed so many of the people doing the counting that we lost track of how many people it actually killed. But here's what you need to hear. They knew it was coming months before those ships pulled into Messina. The warnings were already there. The reports were flowing in from the east, from the trade routes, from people who had watched entire cities go silent. They had time, they had warning, and the people in power did almost nothing. This is the story of what they knew, what they hid, and what it cost. Let me put this in perspective. The Black Death is the most catastrophic event in recorded human history. Not the most dramatic, not the most studied, the most catastrophic. Between 1347 and 1351, 4 years, somewhere between 75 to 200 million people died. Europe's population didn't recover to what it was before the plague for over 150 years. We've all heard about the Black Death. The rats, the fleas, the swellings, the carts full of bodies. We know the symptoms, we know the image. What we don't talk about is the cover-up, the warnings that were ignored, the decisions that were made by people who had the information and sat on it. Here's the thing that changes everything. The Black Death, at the scale it reached, was not inevitable. The death toll wasn't about the disease. It was about choices, human choices, made by people who knew what was coming and calculated what it was worth letting happen. Today we go through 3 of those choices: what actually happened, who rewrote it, and what the echo of those decisions look like right now. Because it looks like something. It looks like a great deal, actually. The plague did not sneak up on anyone. It announced itself. By 1346, a full year before those ships arrived in Sicily, reports were already reaching Europe. Traders coming back from the Silk Road, merchants riding home from the Black Sea. The papal court of Avignon receiving intelligence about mass death moving westward. We know this because the documents survived. Letters, trade dispatches, church reports. The paper trail is actually quite extensive. The people in power knew, at least a year in advance, that something was coming from the east that was killing entire cities. And the response? Almost nothing. No quarantine strategy, no port closures, no suspension of merchant fleets that would carry the disease straight into the heart of the continent. The trade routes stayed open because the trade routes made people rich, and the people who controlled the trade routes were the same people who received the warnings. Here's a detail that should make you angry. The word quarantine, from the Italian quarantena, meaning 40 days, wasn't formally introduced as a public health measure until 1377. 30 years after the first wave. 3 decades of mass death. Before the most obvious possible response was made official policy. Now, I want to be clear about something. The inaction wasn't ignorance. Yes, they didn't understand bacteria. They didn't have germ theory. The medical knowledge of the 14th century was limited. But they understood contagion. They could see it spreading from person to person, ship to city, city to town. The mechanism was a mystery, but the pattern was not. The inaction wasn't ignorance. It was calculation. And the people who made that calculation are not the ones history blamed. History blamed God. History blamed astrology. history blamed the Jews. Jewish communities across Germany and France were accused of poisoning the wells. It led to some of the worst anti-Semitic massacres in European history before the 20th century. The Pope himself issued a document explicitly stating Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else. They could not be responsible. The massacres continued anyway. That pattern of knowing, sitting on it, letting the vulnerable bear the cost, then redirecting the blame outward didn't end in 1351. It has a very long afterlife. We'll come back to that. We talk about the Black Death in percentages. A third of Europe, half in some regions, because the actual numbers are too large to feel real. Let me try to make them real. Florence, 1347. Population roughly 90,000 people. By 1351, fewer than 45,000. The city lost half of its population in 4 years. The streets that had been some of the most crowded in Europe, empty. Houses standing open. Fields untended. Giovanni Boccaccio lived through it. He wrote about it in the Decameron. He described bodies piled in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. England lost between a third and half of its entire population. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people dead in a country of maybe 4 to 5 million. Entire villages just stopped. The archaeological record shows hundreds of settlements that were abandoned during this period and never reoccupied. We call them deserted medieval villages. There are over 3,000 of them in England alone. In parts of rural France, the death rate was exceeded to be 60%. In some monasteries and convents, where people lived close quarters, it reached 100%. Everyone died. Now here's the layer that history class skips. The official death toll has been consistently underestimated. Not accidentally. The institutions that generated historical records, the church, the civic governments, the merchant guilds, were themselves devastated by the plague. The people who counted the dead were dying. The records that survived are the records of institutions that survived. Which means they overrepresent the areas that were less affected. Modern researchers using archaeological evidence like burial sites, pollen records showing when farmland was abandoned, genetic analysis of population bottlenecks, now believe Europe may have lost closer to half of its population rather than a third. Half! In 4 years. And what did the people in power tell everyone was happening? God's punishment, a sign from the heavens, divine retribution for human sin. The flagellant movements, groups of people marching through the streets, publicly whipping themselves, weren't fringe groups. They were a mass movement, tens of thousands of people, because the official explanation for the dying was theological, not institutional, not political. The church, the nobility, the merchants, they needed an explanation that had nothing to do with their own decisions. Theology gave them one. And as a bonus, it redirected all that grief and rage into guilt and self-punishment, instead of toward the people who let the ports open. When a catastrophe gets reframed as God's will, the institutions that caused it survived intact, ready to do it again. Let me be specific about who knew. The Genoese Merchant Republic, one of the most powerful trading empires in the 14th century Europe. They had trading posts across the Black Sea region, right where the plague started. The merchants watched it devastate the area. They wrote home about it, and then they sailed home, carrying it with them, into Sicily, into Genoa, into Marseille, directly into the ports of Western Europe. There is a letter written by a Genoese notary named Gabriel de Mussis in 1348 that describes exactly what they witnessed. Plague victims being catapulted over city walls by the Mongol army besieging Kaffa. Merchants fleeing by ship, knowing the death was on board, being turned away from ports and docking anyway. He describes knowing and going anyway. Venice was equally aware. They introduced early quarantine measures, but applied them selectively. Merchant ships carrying high-value cargo got different treatment than everyone else. The economics of who got protected were not equal. The Papal Court of Avignon, one of the best informed institutions in all of Europe, received reports from across the continent. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued the document protecting Jewish communities from blame. He also sold indulgences for plague victims, enriching the church from the very catastrophe his institution helped enable. Now here's the most important thing I'm going to say in this entire video. The structure of who knew and who bore the cost is not that medieval anomaly. It is a pattern, a recurring feature of how institutional power operates when it sees a catastrophe coming. The information existed. The people with access to it had the ability to act. The action required would have cost them. Closing trade routes, suspended commerce, distributed profitable systems. So the inaction happened instead, and the cost was paid, almost entirely, by the people with no ability to close themselves off. The poor, the agricultural workers, the communities with no resources to isolate. The flagellants were blamed. The Jews were massacred. God was invoked, and the merchants went back to trading as soon as the worst had passed. The echo's not subtle. The echo's loud. The echo has a pulse. Every time a predictable catastrophe, environmental, epidemical, economic, gets met with the same sequence. Early warnings, institutional inaction, costs absorbed by the vulnerable, blame redirected outward, and the power surviving intact to preside over the next one. You are watching the Black Death on a different stage with different customs. The disease changes, the structure does not. That is the unmarked grave of the Black Death, not the bodies in the streets of Florence, not the deserted villages of England, but the decision-making structure that produced those bodies and those villages. The one that was carefully, deliberately, not what got buried. Somewhere between 75 to 200 million people died. That range, the gap, tells you something on its own. We genuinely don't know the real number, because the catastrophe consumed the people doing the counting. But what we do know is that it didn't have to be that large. The scale of the dying wasn't just about the disease. It was about choices made by people who had the information, who had the resources, who chose to protect what they had, rather than what they were responsible for. That story is not in the textbooks. It's not in the documentaries about rats and fleas. It's in the letters that survived, the documents nobody put on the syllabus. That's what this channel is for. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. New episode every Thursday. And leave a comment. I really want to know which part landed the hardest for you. The cover-up, the death toll, or the echo. I read every single one.